from Monument to Glyph, Part A. Have you ever wondered what happens to a civilization's knowledge when it can no longer afford to build in mountains? That is the question waiting on the far side of Stonehenge. If Stonehenge and sites like it are examples of memory built at monumental scale, then another problem quickly appears. Monumentality is powerful, but it is expensive. It requires labor, coordination, continuity, materials, skill, and a social order stable enough to sustain long-range building. A civilization at or near coherence may be able to create such works. A civilization under stress may not. A civilization after rupture almost certainly cannot. So what happens then? Does the knowledge vanish? Sometimes yes, but not always. One of the central ideas of this book is that civilizational knowledge does not only disappear, often it compresses. That word matters here just as much as recurrence mattered in the Stonehenge chapter. Compression. When something is compressed, it is not necessarily destroyed. It is reduced, folded, packed, and transformed into a smaller or denser form that can survive under new conditions. A great city may collapse into a village. A ritual sequence may collapse into a gesture. A large architectural teaching system may collapse into a shrine, a symbol, a myth, a repeated image, a script, or a story. The scale changes, the bandwidth narrows, but some of the pattern remains. This is not a strange idea. It happens everywhere in human life. A song survives after the empire that composed it is gone. A proverb survives after the law that once explained it has vanished. A child's game preserves an older sequence no one remembers consciously. A religious gesture outlives the cosmology that gave it birth. In the same way, a glyph may preserve what a monument once taught more completely. That possibility is essential to Geonosis and to Methode glyph, because once one learns to see ancient monuments as structured memory systems, it becomes increasingly difficult to treat later visual cultures as unrelated decoration. Instead, one begins to suspect continuity through compression. The monument says it in stone. The glyph says it in image. The ritual says it in sequence. The myth says it in narrative. The script says it in portable form. Different media, different scales, sometimes the same inheritance. This is why the modern habit of separating architecture, symbol, religion, mythology, and writing into neat institutional drawers can become such a hindrance. A civilization under pressure does not always preserve its knowledge in the categories a university would prefer. It preserves what it can in the media still available, using the people, materials, and habits that remain. If a megalithic coherent system can no longer be built, perhaps a procession survives. If the procession is no longer fully understood, perhaps an emblem survives. If the emblem is forgotten, perhaps a myth survives. If the myth is doubted, perhaps a gesture survives. And if the gesture is copied long enough, perhaps one day someone notices that it is the fragment of a much older machine. That is the work of compression. This chapter matters because it helps answer one of the biggest objections to the whole thesis of this book. If ancient civilizations knew so much, why did they not simply tell us plainly? The answer is that many of them may have done exactly that, but not in the form modernity prefers. They may have told us plainly in form, plainly in pattern, plainly in image, plainly in repeated sequence, plainly in visual systems that remained legible only so long as people still knew how to look. The tragedy is not necessarily that the ancients failed to speak. It may be that we forgot how to read their preferred media. This is where the movement from monument to glyph becomes crucial. A monument is powerful because it dominates place. A glyph is powerful because it travels. A monument interrupts the horizon. A glyph interrupts the page, the wall, the vessel, the tablet, the codex, the body. Monuments are hard to erase, but difficult to reproduce. Glyphs are easy to distribute, but easier to misread. That trade-off defines much of civilizational afterlife. A people in decline, dispersion, migration, trauma, conquest, or simplification may no longer be able to reproduce its largest architectures, but it may still preserve fragments of the same logic in images, carvings, motifs, ceremonial structures, repeated forms, or teaching stories. What was once enacted at full scale becomes teachable in miniature. This does not mean the miniature is trivial. Sometimes a compressed form carries astonishing density. A single glyph can contain action, relation, warning, category, memory, and instruction if it is part of a system. A sequence of images can preserve an operational understanding long after the words around it have drifted. A script may not be phonetic text with pictures attached, but a visual technology for carrying structured meaning across time. That last possibility will matter very much later in this book. For now, the central principle is simple. When civilizations lose bandwidth, they compress. They compress into stone relief. They compress into icon. They compress into rite. They compress into pattern. They compress into story. And these compressed forms may remain coherent long after the larger social world that created them has been broken apart. That is why a later age may inherit fragments that seem mysterious, excessive, or merely ornamental. The fragments are real. The difficulty is that their original operating scale is gone. A symbol once embedded in a monumental system now floats loose on a tablet. A ritual once tied to a landscape is now performed indoors. A story once enacted in architecture is now told by people who only dimly remember what its images once coordinated. The result is not nonsense. It is surviving compression. Once this becomes visible, the ancient world begins to organize itself differently. You stop seeing monuments, glyphs, scripts, and myths as separate curiosities and begin seeing them as media across which intelligence can migrate. That is the key word here: migrate. Civilizational knowledge migrates across forms. When it cannot remain where it was, it moves. From landform to monument, from monument to wall, from wall to tablet, from tablet codex, from codex to story, from story to symbol, from symbol to ritual, and sometimes, if the chain is not fully broken, back again into recognition. This is why I do not think of ancient image systems as decorative leftovers from supposedly pre-logical peoples. I think of them as compression surfaces. They are places where complex knowledge has been packed into enduring visual form under conditions where full-scale explanation may no longer have been possible. That is not primitiveness. That is adaptation. And once you begin to suspect that adaptation of this kind has occurred, the whole ancient archive changes character. It stops looking like a cemetery of unrelated fragments and starts looking like a damaged but still connected network. This chapter, then, is a bridge. It bridges the monumental world of Stonehenge and the coming chapters on walls, scripts, codices, and visual systems. It asks the reader to consider that the same civilizational intelligence which once built in stone may later have had to build an image instead. And if that is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How do we recognize a glyph not as decoration but as compressed architecture?